What is up, WAP Attack? I had a long morning of meetings, and I'm very excited to be able to do some WAP and talk about the Mongols right now. I hope you guys had a fantastic weekend. Um, I spent a lot of time looking over your DBQ outlines and your SAQs, and they're very solid. I was very happy with them. I think you guys are doing a really good job. I think that I was definitely a little bit I was definitely a little bit more lenient as far as grading when it comes to some of the more advanced skills, particularly happying and the counter argument. And I think what I'm going to do as I go through, these review DBQs is I am going to be a little bit more critical of those particular areas. And it will be like a quarter of a point taken off those sort of things. Obviously, I'm not going to give bad grades as long as you're working hard, but I do want you guys to get some specific feedback. And so I did leave feedback on Schoology for you guys. If you go on to the um, comments of where you turned in your submission box, and so that there's something to consider there. All right, guys. So let's talk. We are finishing up Unit 2, but we're also finishing up on this time period in general. And this time period, again, is circa 1200 to 1450. We talked about all of the politics in Unit 1, and Unit 2 is a lot about interaction of cultures. That is a big theme that the College Board loves to test us on, is the interaction of cultures. And what are the evidence of that interaction? What are the results of that interaction? And when you look at these key themes of the unit, 3 out of the 4, it's all about interaction of cultures. I mean, they're really hitting us home with this. And the Indian Ocean trade, biggest transfer of goods, ideas, religion. We also got that land-based Silk Road trade, the spread of Islam, another interaction of culture, as Islam is spreading throughout Northern Africa and the Indian Ocean trade routes. And then the Mongols. And you don't think of the Mongols necessarily as interacting in culture, but the Mongols are perhaps the biggest reason and why culture spread throughout Eurasia for 100 years between 1250 and 1350, because they established that huge land-based empire, because they encouraged trade within their empire. And so today's discussion is going to be all about interaction of culture, and that actually starts with the Mongols. The key dates for this unit, I've narrowed it down to 3. One is the First Crusade, 1095 to 1099. Great contextual evidence there. The Fourth Crusade, for a couple reasons. That's the last major crusade, but it's also the one in which they sacked Constantinople. So if you wanted to know when Constantinople becomes weakened, that would be the time to do so. And then finally, the Mongols, the 4 Mongol Khanates ruling Eurasia from 1250 to 1350. All right, let's talk about the Mongols. So the Mongols start in East Asia. If you look on this map over to the left, just to the north of China. But because of their location, they lived on what we call the steppe, the Asian steppe. And the Asian steppe is a grasslandy, rocky soiled area in which agriculture is very difficult. As you go further north, it becomes shorter growing seasons, meaning there's less sunlight and more difficult to sustain agriculture. Because of this, our people in Mongolia did not live a sedentary lifestyle, meaning they didn't stay in one place. They often moved from place to place. But in moving from place to place, they adapted a certain type of lifestyle to fit their environment, and that would be pastoralism. Our Mongols were nomadic pastoralists, which means that they moved from place to place. They mostly raised goats and sheep, and then, of course, horses, which was a huge part of their lifestyle. And obviously, you need available grass for your livestock to be able to eat. And so you're going to move from place to place, because when you stay in one place too long, the livestock is going to eat all of the available grass, and then you got to move to a new place. And our Mongols, because they were nomadic, they weren't living in huge major cities. They were living by families or clans and or tribes. And these tribes were very egalitarian in nature. They were very simple as far as how they lived. They would go depending on the seasons. If it was a colder climate, they would move further south towards the equator, and vice versa if it was a warmer time of the year. Both the men and the women would wear leather trousers. They were very egalitarianly dressed. A huge contrast between Europe, where you see the women in these, especially the aristocratic women in the corsets. Very the polar opposite over here in Central Asia and East Asia, where our Mongolian women are dressed exactly like the men, and they lived in these circular, flat-shaped tents over here called yurts. And yurts were going to be where they brought everything, where they, all their tools and their clothes and everything that they live with, so that they could stay in one place for a couple of weeks and then move on to the next place. Okay, so our Mongols had a high desire for trade, even though they were not located along the major trade routes. They, of course, did like nice things, and they wanted to be able to trade with their neighbors for jewelry, for silk, where you would get from China, but also just for agriculture, for agricultural goods to eat. And because of this, the Mongols always resented other wealthy tribes that were located along the Silk Roads, and they always wanted a way into which to get closer to the Silk Roads. But because our early Mongol lifestyle was so nomadic, and because we didn't have centralized Mongol tribes, we had very small tribes based off of families or clans, they never had the military capacity to be able to come in and compete with some of the other major states and civilizations along the Silk Roads, like the Jin Empire to the north of China. Um, Talking about our Mongol women had perhaps the best lifestyles in Asia. They were very much a part of public life. They were trained to ride horses. They did very much the same thing that men did out in everyday life. They would go hunting. They would tend to the goats or the sheep or the horses. They also had great political rights. They could initiate a divorce. They could remarry, and some women even fought in the military. And so, when you juxtapose this with the women in China or the women in India, who are close neighbors with the Mongols, obviously that the Mongols had a much better lifestyle for their women. The major form of fighting that the Mongols would engage in would be the mounted archers. This was their very, very famous fighting lifestyle. And in fact, from a very, very young age, all members of Mongol society would learn how to ride, and they would learn how to shoot. In fact, there would be one of the biggest celebrations of the entire year was a major hunting feast called the Gorgon, in which all members of the Mongol society would come in and encircle a large herd of game, and each archer was armed with only one arrow, and the task was to be able to kill an animal and bring it to the feast. And if you were unable to kill an animal, you were met with ridicule. And so this was the kind of lifestyle that our Mongols kind of bred to be fighters, to be hunters, and to be excellent riders of horsemen, to have excellent horsemanship. And as they later became centralized under Genghis Khan, they would use this form of military to come in and extract wealth from other civilizations. At any one time, Genghis Khan only had 23,000 men in his, or I should say men and women, in his military. And this was, really dwarfed by some of the European armies that came to the Crusades or some of the Muslim armies. And yet, because of this ferocious and very mobile type of fighting, that they could defeat far, far bigger armies because it was just impossible to catch them. And because they wore this very light armor, this leather armor that was waterproof, and they really made some of the classic armies with their full suit and armor really look bad because they would be, completely overwhelmed by this Mongol quickness and speed. So perhaps one of the most famous men of all time, Temujin, as you will know him as Genghis Khan, he is credited as uniting the Mongol tribes together into the fearsome kingdom, the fearsome empire that it becomes. How did he rise to power? First, he's going to ally with several Mongol tribes, and then after he has formed an alliance, he will defeat neighboring groups one by one, including a neighboring group that had captured his wife, and they were brutally slain. And so he gets this reputation as a ruthless killer, someone you don't want to be fighting against. And yet he also had the reputation for being a great leader that promoted people based off of merit. And what I mean by that is that he didn't necessarily promote people that were in his own family. And in fact, the Mongols had these very, very big families because of the way in which they would take the women after fighting. And yet he really promoted only the people that he trusted and the people that he respected. And the best example of that was a general that he fought against, that he named Jeeb, and we talked about this in class, or Arrow, because he was shot by this opposing enemy after one of these battles in Central Asia. And he actually appointed him to be his top general in his military. And so he was very much based off of meritocracy, that he promoted people because of their abilities and not because of patronage or because of they were related to him. The Kurultai is in 1206. The Kurultai is a meeting of Mongol leaders. They came in and they voted for Temujin to be the leader of the Mongols, and he became Genghis Khan, or the universal or supreme ruler of all. It's a pretty cool video that I've attached into this PowerPoint on Genghis Khan, some really interesting background on him if you want to check it out. But more so than Genghis Khan, we need to know the impact and the effects of the Mongols and how they changed society. And they changed Eurasian society in many different ways. They changed warfare. They changed warfare certainly because of the speed of the Mongol army, because of the organization of the Mongol army, and because of the technology that the Mongols used. First of all, Genghis Khan is going to organize the Mongol army into units of 10. Each unit of 10 had a leader, and there was an obvious and straightforward chain of command. 10 groups of 10 would become 100, 1,000, and then the largest groups of armies were called tumens, and there was 10,000. When other tribes were captured by Genghis Khan, he would intentionally split up family members and close friends to different groups of 10, different tumens, so that he could keep their loyalty to him. Also, their technology. Their technology is a big one. The Mongols are going to capture engineers from different societies that they're fighting against, for instance, Chinese engineers. And they're going to use Chinese engineers to develop what we call siege weapons. Siege weapons are weapons for the purpose of putting a walled city to siege. And the major cities in this time period are walled cities. When you look at some of the cities that fell to the Mongols in this time period, when you look at Kiev in Russia, walled city. Baghdad was a walled city. When you look at Zhengzhou, modern day Beijing, that's a walled city. All of these major cities with high casualties will only be able to be exploited by the Mongols because of this technology of the people that they conquered. The two best examples of this are catapults. We know what a catapult is. And the other one's a siege tower. And this was created by Chinese artisans and engineers, where you literally build a mobile tower that you can climb up from the inside, and you're able to make it up to the top of this tower, and you bring this tower over to one of the walls of the city that you're putting to siege, and you can literally walk up in the inside of the tower and be protected from projectiles, and then jump onto the wall and enter the city. The Mongols, although they didn't invent gunpowder, the Chinese in the Tang Dynasty invented gunpowder, and then the Songs used it for the first guns. The Mongols did adapt their gunpowder technology and then bring it across Europe, Eurasia, and then all the way to Europe, so that Europeans started using gunpowder even as early as the 100 Years' War, which was England versus France. Other techniques that the Mongols used, they're incredibly fast, speed messenger forces, sometimes having riders ride entirely through the night, even sleeping on their horses. And then the fake retreat technique, which is one of my personal favorites, which is where the main army, the Tumen, is hiding behind a large hill, and then you send up only a couple of mounted riders to engage a bigger army, fire upon that army, and then run, and then bring that opposing army into a trap and to engage the larger Tumen. And that was really one of Genghis Khan's favorite techniques that he used over and over again. What part of what made the Mongols so unique is that they had incredible loyalty to their leaders. And they had incredible loyalty because, for one, if you tried to desert or leave the battlefield, that was an offense punishable by death. But also, the leaders of the Mongols would fight. Genghis Khan would fight. These Batu Khan would fight. These people would fight at the head of their armies, and they were known for their military acumen, for their fighting skills. And not only that, but once a civilization had been conquered, all of the wealth of that civilization was divided amongst everyone, and not just the leader. So everybody had a reason to fight alongside the leaders, because everyone could become wealthy through this kind of plundering lifestyle. The Mongols actually won more battles before they even arrived than actual warfare battles. And what I mean by that is Genghis Khan and then his grandsons after him would send in a small group to the enemy asking for a surrender. Oftentimes, because of the notorious bloodshed that was shed by the Mongols, people would surrender. They would not be willing to fight against the Mongols, especially because if you did surrender to the Mongols and you followed their rules, you'd benefit from that. You would see increased trade. You would see your religion very tolerated under Mongol rule. But if you refused, then you're going to have a really tough time of it. The Khan would come in and kill all of the aristocrats, all the landowners. They would make all the artisans and the skilled workers serve the Mongol army, and the non-skilled workers would either be killed, or they would carry loot back to the Mongol capital, or they would be human shields in combat. Some pretty nasty stuff. There was certainly mass slaughters by the Mongols. There was a couple. The best examples, perhaps, are Kiev and Baghdad. At Baghdad, the reports are 200,000 slaughtered by the Mongols, which means certainly that there was a lot of people killed and a lot of innocent people killed. And this was as much psychological warfare as anything else. The thought process in this is that these are people that resist us. If you resist, everyone is going to die. And so certainly this worked for them in a way in which many people surrendered before the fighting actually took place. In a stark contrast from this, however, we see that once Eurasia has been conquered, there is no more people to fight. You can see that the far western portion of this Mongol Empire makes its way into modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and then all the way over to the eastern portions of China and Mongolia. And by controlling all of Eurasia, the Mongols are able to completely enforce rules of their kingdom. They had a law code called the Yasa, which was the law of the land throughout Eurasia, and you had to follow these rules. And part of those rules were free trade, that you were not going to harm merchants moving through. There also was with one exception, there were no rules on religion. You could practice any religion you want as long as it didn't inhibit your ability to follow Mongol law. So as long as your religion kept you loyal to the Mongols, you could practice any religion that you want. And so Pax Mongolica actually was very beneficial for the civilizations involved, including some of the ones that hit some of the major deaths, and like China, for instance. I mean, China lost hundreds of thousands of people in the Mongol wars. But after the Mongols had successfully conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, they went into a golden age of art and literature and religion and all these things. So Pax Mongolica, very contradictory, but actually a good time for Eurasia. Right, talking about the religious policies in the Mongol Empire. In total religious toleration, there's many different religions in the Mongol Empire. The biggest ones: Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Taoism, of course, a little bit of Hinduism. As the Ogadai, Genghis Khan's son, moved into northern India. Marco Polo, we've talked about this guy in several contexts. We'll talk about him again today briefly. But his travels to China is going to be entirely through Mongol territory. That is how much land the Mongols control. And he is going to keep a diary of everything that he encountered along the way. And it's because of the safety that the Mongols established in their empire that Marco Polo would have been able to travel all the way over to China and back on his long expedition. Um, okay, so the actual fighting and the locations and the empire. So Temujin was named Genghis Khan at the Kurultai in 1206, and the first place that he's going to attack is the Jin Empire. The Jin Empire is that Manchu Empire that came in and attacked northern China during the Song Dynasty. He's going to destroy the capital there at Zhengdu. And this is where he's going to earn his reputation because all of these people that resist him are going to be killed, including civilizations. And then, of course, Jeeb, his trusted general, who I already talked about, was the one that shot Genghis Khan in battle, shot him, grazed him in the neck. And Genghis Khan lines up the enemy army in front of him, and he walks down and looks every soldier in the eyes, and he says, "Who shot me in the neck?" And Jeeb steps forward, and he is then, from that point forward, made a general in Genghis Khan's army. This is, as I put down at the bottom, an example of the Mongol meritocracy, meaning they've earned it. They are being promoted on merit. But Genghis Khan dies in 1227. He dies actually not through battle, but probably because of injuries he sustained after falling off his horse in his 60s. But his third son, Ogadai, is chosen to succeed him. And Ogadai is elected the emperor at the Kurultai, just as his father was. While Ogadai does expand the empire, Ogadai really dies prematurely because he's an alcoholic. He's going to die of alcoholism. He mostly spends his days in Karakorum, which is the capital of Mongolia, where he starts to build a permanent city. But we more study the Mongols through Genghis Khan and then his grandsons. And there's 3 grandsons that we have to know. And not only do we have to remember who the grandsons were, who they conquered, but also what was their style of rule, right? And those are the 3 things that we have to know. And so one of these grandsons that we have to know about is Batu Khan. Batu Khan is going to come into modern day Russia. And one of the major cities that is exploited is Kiev. Kiev is completely burned to the ground. And in fact, he then is going to continue moving west. And you can see from this map, here's Kiev, making their way into modern day Hungary. And he actually comes in and confronts and defeats an army of Hungarian and Austrian soldiers. I mean, here we are in Central Europe. And it looks as though Batu Khan is going to continue to move into Western Europe. I mean, how much would history have changed had Batu Khan made his way into Western Europe? But just in that moment, back in Karakorum, back in the capital, Ogadai died. And because of this, Batu Khan has to return to the capital to deal with who will be the next leader. He has to attend a new Kurultai. And because of this, he never moves into Western Europe. But of course, Russia and modern-day Ukraine still conquered by the Mongols, and so we need to know how they ruled in Russia. And as many places, they ruled through existing rulers, meaning they allowed the Russian leaders, at this point, leading over city-states called Kiev and Rus. They allowed those Russian leaders to continue to rule. And in fact, the Mongols didn't like Russia. It was cold, it was very forested, and there was nowhere for their horses to settle down and eat the grass on plains. And in fact, it was difficult to ride. And so the Mongols didn't like it. And they said, okay, we're going to continue to control your territory, but we're not going to live here. We're going to collect tribute from the Russian city-states, and as long as you pay us tribute, we're not going to have any problems. However, Russian rulers started to get smart. And in fact, the rulers in Moscow, a leader by the name of Prince Dmitry, is going to start to collect extra tribute for the purpose of setting aside money every month to be able to eventually be able to pay for a fearsome army and confront the Mongols. And they do so, the Russians do, in a very famous battle in 1380 called the Battle of Kulikovo. And this is various city-states of Russia all coming together to fight against the Golden Horde, Batu Khan and the Golden Horde. And this is a victory by Russians, by particularly Moscow. Moscow starts to become the primary and most important city-state in Russia. And from that point forward, we start to see leaders from Moscow calling themselves czars. And that's where we start to see the Russia becoming a nation state and not a bunch of city states. So this Battle of Kulakova is really important for two reasons. It's a turning point in Mongol history because the Mongols are kicked out of Russia, and it's a turning point in Russian history because now Russia becomes a centralized nation state. It is important to note, though, that because Russia was under occupation by the Mongols for so long, that they did not go through some of the changes that occurred in Western Europe. For instance, the abolition of feudalism or the Renaissance, where we saw this big expansion of the middle class. And because of this, Russia stayed very medieval for a lot longer than the rest of Europe. The second grandson that we learn about is Hulagu, or Hulegu, depending on how you pronounce it. And he is going to make his way into modern-day Saudi Arabia and make his way into Persia and the Middle East. In 1258, he's going to come into the Abbasid Caliphate, and he is going to lead to the end of the Abbasid Caliphate because he's going to destroy the city of Baghdad and kill the caliph. And in fact, he destroys the House of Wisdom. And in fact, they said that the rivers ran black with ink from the books that are being dumped into the rivers. And so some really nasty cultural destruction by Hulagu. And in fact, he looks like he's going to move even further west and maybe even challenge the Holy Land itself. And this is how dire the situation is when you look at this. Muslim Mamluks, so Muslims and Christian Crusaders, are actually going to come together. They're going to band together to defeat Hulagu from moving into the Holy Land. That's how dire the situation was when we get into the complete Mongol occupation of Eurasia. So again, this is what's going to stop the Mongols from moving further west and only controlling Eastern Europe and not all of the Middle East. But how does Hulagu rule? And you can see, if we look at the Mongol Khanates, I like this map for this reason. We can see here's Batu Khan in Russia, and here's Il Khanate, which is where Hulagu is, and then the large one over here, Khanate of the Great Khan, that is Kublai Khan controlling China. And then in the middle, this is where we'll have Ogedai's Khanate. So Hulagu's kingdom, it's called Il Khanate, and once again, like in Russia, Hulagu is going to allow local officials to rule, and this is because people were already paying taxes and tribute to their local officials, and so the Mongols felt as though this is the easiest way for us to get wealth, because we can have the people who already trust our local rulers continue to pay us, and we're going to make the most money out of doing this. The difference with Hulagu is that this becomes the only non-tolerant area of the Mongol Empire, because Hulagu and many of the Mongols are going to convert to Islam, and they are going to kind of turn to a more radical form of Islam. And really, it's not even Islam at this point. It's kind of a Mongolized version, and they're going to justify their faith by slaughtering Jews and Christians. And so that is our one place in the Mongol large empire that is not tolerant of all religions. And then last but not least, we have Kublai Khan, who probably does the most amazing conquering, because he is up against the largest foe, Song China. Song China at this stage is the richest and most technically advanced area of the world. And it's going to be a long siege. It's going to take 36 years to be able to completely defeat the Song dynasty. But he is going to assume the title of the Great Khan, and later he's going to be called the Emperor. He establishes the Yuan dynasty, and in fact, he rebuilds Zhongdu Beijing. And his grandfather, Genghis Khan, had destroyed it, and he's going to rebuild it. Kublai Khan, unlike Hulagu, is going to allow religious tolerance, and that means that our less popular religions and philosophies in China are going to flourish. We talk about Buddhists and Taoists who, while they're very popular in China, they don't present an entryway to the government like Confucianism did, they're going to rejoice under Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is not going to make it a requirement to study Confucianism to get into the government. He, like his grandfather Genghis Khan, is going to promote people based off of merit. And because of this, we saw Buddhists enter the government, we saw Muslims enter the government, we saw Taoists, although Taoism is a philosophy, but nonetheless. We also see that China, as I mentioned earlier, is going to prosper in the Yuan dynasty. They're protected by the strongest army in the world because the Mongols protected trade. They improved trade, and also they have an art and literature golden period because the Mongols let you do what you wanted to do. If you wanted to explore your own culture, so be it, as long as you're following by the yasa or the law code of the land. Now, unfortunately, the Mongols did make some mistakes in China, and they did not understand Chinese culture in a full capacity. For instance, if you're going to try and legitimize your rule in China, the one thing you don't want to do is dismantle the civil service exam. The civil service exam is started by Han Wudi back in the Han Dynasty. We're talking about 200 BC that this was created. And so here we are over 1,000 years later, dismantling the civil service exam. This is a huge cultural continuity that is disrupted, and that's going to upset many Chinese citizens, rightfully so. Now that the civil service exam is disrupted, we saw people being hired to the government that were from all over, foreigners, Buddhists, Taoists, etc. And this is going to upset the most important social class in China, the scholar gentry, who are so influential. And so this is going to lead to unrest in China. They're also going to try and conquer Japan. And the Mongols never had a strong navy, and then they got caught in a typhoon. And so the Mongol military very, very weakened by this attempt to come into Japan. And so this leaves the door open for a peasant rebellion. And the White Lotus Society is going to come together. They form a secret society. And then Zhu Yongzong is a Buddhist monk who's going to lead a revolt and form the Ming Dynasty. And more on the Ming Dynasty when we get into our next unit. So what are the effects of the Mongols? Well, they created the biggest land-based empire of all time. They then, after all the bloodshed and conquering, are going to then usher in a time of Pax Mongolica, which means peace. They're going to protect trade in Eurasia. They're going to build roads and bridges to increase trade. A big one is spreading technology. The College Board loves the fact that the Mongols, because they all controlled Eurasia, we saw free-flowing spread of the ideas and technology. The big one, gunpowder to the Western world. But you'll also see things like disease spread to the Western world, or paper technology make it to the Western world. An example of a centralized power that many civilizations would emulate, a single law code. I talked about that already. The plague from southern China to Europe, devastating in Europe, killing 1/3 of the population. So obviously this was a huge impact of the Mongols. Raising the views of women in the areas they conquered, talked about the egalitarian nature of our Mongol women. Very much this, in anywhere that they conquered, we saw the status of women increase, at least temporarily, while under Mongol control. And then 7 and 8 really especially applies to the Middle East and Europe, where we saw these large walled cities that were protected by knights in armor. The Mongols made this form of warfare seem foolish because of their siege weapons, because of their mobile armies. And so this was the end of an era as far as knights in the walled city era. Okay, so now I'm just going to go over just really a review briefly of the cultural changes and just a tiny bit of environmental effects, and we'll be done with this time period, circa 1200 to 1450, Unit 1 and 2. This is the end of Unit 2, so let's get into it briefly. This is the era of connectivity. This is where we see all of the Eastern Hemisphere connected together, and we see lots of exchange. And we talk about the exchange of religions, and we talk about the exchange of goods and all these things. Because this is when many of the major religions were created, this is really that time period where we see the most exchange of religion and ideas. Our next time period, we will of course see more exchange, but it will be over here in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so our caravans through the Sahara and the Gobi deserts, that's going to allow goods and therefore everything else to be exchanged in the Indian Ocean. Of course, the Mongol Empire, so lots of cultural exchange. Okay, let's talk about Buddhism making its way into East Asia. This is very much review. Zhuangzong, the Chinese monk, is going to come along the Silk Roads. He's going to visit India. He's going to study the Buddhist classics. He's going to return to China. He's going to translate those Buddhist classics into Chinese and introduce Buddhism to the area. Monks are going to follow. They're going to relate Buddhism to the Taoist principles that are already so heavily used in China. And because of this, we'll have a syncretic religion, Zen Buddhism, otherwise called Chan Buddhism, that's going to be very popular with the Chinese peasants. Buddhism is going to create some political disruption. The Tang dynasty is not going to like it. They're going to shut it down because it's a foreign religion, and their monasteries didn't pay taxes. But the Song dynasty is going to embrace Buddhism because paper became more widespread. In the Song dynasty, we saw lots of Buddhist scriptures more available, and because the most well-read people in the Song dynasty were the scholar gentry began to appreciate Buddhism, and we see a syncretic religion, Neo-Confucianism, which is the rational thought of Confucianism, but also elements of Taoism and Buddhism. As far as religion in Asia as well, we see Chinese religions and philosophies make their way into Korea and Japan and Vietnam. That, of course, is scenification. The Korean elite, Korea is the best example because of its location. Korean elite studying Confucianism, Korean peasants studying Buddhism. Neo-Confucianism becomes Korea's official state ideology. So lots of exchange there. So when we talk about East Asia, we're talking about mainly Chinese influence and then Indian influence because of Buddhism. Buddhism started in India. But when we talk about Southeast Asia, it gets a little bit more complex. Southeast Asia is going to go through lots of change, cultural change. The first peoples that are going to be in Southeast Asia are going to be the South Indian kingdoms, like the Chola kingdom, for instance. And when the Chola kingdom comes through, they're going to bring their first religion, Hinduism. And so we're going to see Hinduism in Southeast Asia first. Then we'll have merchants from India and from China that are going to be Buddhist. And so then we'll have Buddhism down here, and then finally we'll have Islam. It's always going to follow the timeline of when these religions were created. First was Hinduism, then was Buddhism, then was Islam. And so if we remind ourselves, the kingdoms in Southeast Asia initially, Srivijaya kingdom, it's very much based off of taxing ships coming through this Malacca Strait. They're Hindu. They're going to be then followed by the Majapahit kingdom, who was a Buddhist kingdom and controlled trade through here. Then we'll have the Malacca kingdom come in and a same way, tax ships through the area. They're a Muslim kingdom. And then up in Vietnam, modern day Vietnam and Cambodia, mostly Cambodia, we see the Angkor Kingdom. And the Angkor Kingdom, because of its location especially, is going to be heavily influenced by India. India first, we're going to have Indian merchants and advisors come over and teach Hinduism to the Angkor Kingdom, otherwise called the Khmer people. They're going to build tremendous Hindu artwork and statues of Hindu gods. But then later, when Buddhism makes its way into the Angkor Kingdom, we're going to see our Khmer rulers convert to Buddhism, and they're going to add Buddhist sculptures and artwork to their royal city, Angkor Thom. So Angkor Thom, the best example we can really look at to trace cultural change, because it starts Hindu and then it becomes Buddhist. The spread of Islam is going to affect many different places as well. The best proselytizers of the time period are our Sufis, because of their focus on introspection and their own personal relationship with God, that we saw it more palatable for other religions to be able to start to convert to Islam. A couple of cultural influences. First in Eastern Africa, when our Islamic merchants, especially our Arab merchants, coming over into Eastern Africa, they're going to engage with Bantu-speaking people, and because of this, we'll have a mixture language, a syncretic language between Bantu and Arabic that becomes Swahili. Also in northern Western Africa, the Hausa kingdoms, we see Islam make its way across the Trans-Saharan Desert, and that's where we'll see these new Muslim cities like Timbuktu becomes a center of learning with libraries and book buying and all those things. And Mansa Musa, of course, we've talked about many times, of the Malian Empire, who contributed to the birth of Timbuktu. Cultural influences of Islam in South Asia. So South Asia, of course, is India. And before Islam, of course, in India, Hinduism and Buddhism are most popular. But then comes Islam. How is that going to affect South Asia? We know that still today, the mass majority of people in India are in fact Hindu. So what did then? We have lots of converts to Islam. No, however, if people did convert, they were going to be low caste Hindus looking to escape the caste system and Buddhists. We also saw a mixture of cultures in architecture. We saw Hindu designs mixed with Islamic patterns, like the Qutb Minar, which is still to this day the highest point in India. And then Urdu, which is a mixture of Hindi, Arabic, and Farsi. Farsi spoken in the Middle East. And this is, to this day, the language in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Okay, transfer of scientific and technological innovations. Lots of examples of this. Our Islamic scholars, of course, are going to transfer scientific innovation because they're constantly translating books from different languages, and because they're interacting with so many people. Because of all of our Islamic merchants, we see mathematics brought from India, paper making brought from China. Other technological innovations, Vietnam is going to present China with champa rice as a tribute. That's going to largely affect agriculture and lead to a large population boom in Song China, where we see the percentage of the world goes from 25% of the entire world is Chinese to 40% of the entire world are in China. That's how many people are in China. And then we have the four innovations that help Indian Ocean trade: lateen sailed, stirred runner, the astrolabe, and the magnetic compass, all of which transferred through the Indian Ocean so that other cultures have this as well. We also see one of our first diasporic cities, the southern tip of the Grand Canal, Hangzhou. Hangzhou becomes a major trading city. And because of its location along the Grand Canal, we're going to have lots of merchants from India and from the Middle East come to Hangzhou, where they're going to look to trade. We see one of the first places in the entire world where we're going to see 1 million people. I mean, this is very, very unusual for the time period. We don't see this amount of people really until we get to around 1750 with the Industrial Revolution. But this is a pure diasporic community because we have lots of Arabs, we have lots of Indians, and of course we have lots of Chinese. It also is a center of flourishing of poets and writers and artists. Lots of different religions there coming together and speaking philosophy. That makes it very similar to Timbuktu in Western Africa or Calicut in India. Lots of interaction of cultures. Place on land where we have lots of interaction of cultures is Kashgar. We've talked about Kashgar before. It features an oasis because of the Kashgar River, and many people would stop along these oases along the land-based Silk Roads, largely about 100 miles apart, because that's where the caravanserai were, the inns where people could stop and get food or food for their animals or trade for a new animal. Kashgar was first a Buddhist city because of merchants coming from India or China, but later it became a center of Islamic worship, which shows the obvious amount of Muslim merchants coming from Arabia and Persia. Okay, the Crusades are going to have cultural impacts and other impacts on the world, one of which is the Fourth Crusade led to the end for the Byzantine Empire, the last of the Roman Empire. The Fourth Crusade, disastrous because our Crusaders, of course, sacked Constantinople, but also when our Crusaders returned from the Middle East, they brought back the plague, and the bubonic plague killed about half of the city's people between 1346 and 1349. The big cities obviously affected more by sickness. Um, this allowed the Ottoman Turks to come in and conquer Constantinople in 1453, the very beginning of our next unit. Um, Obviously, knowledge of the world beyond Western Europe was brought back by the Crusades, which brought interest in silks and medicines and all these things. And we already talked about the Black Death. Um, how does the Great Plague make its way across Eurasia? Many people blame the Mongols, and rightfully so, because the Mongols encouraged so much trade in their empire that we did see widespread interaction and transmission of disease. The other thing is that the plague could be held in animals, fleas, for instance, and because we saw these caravanserai, where all these different animals are held with human beings, it's going to lead to transfer of a lot of different disease. Making its way over to Europe, 1/3 of the entire continent of Europe is going to be killed by the plague. But this does have the side effect of ending feudalism in Europe because of the lack of available serfs. The areas that were least affected, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And when we talk about South Asia, that's India. And we talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, that would be below the Sahara Desert. And that's largely because these are accessible by sea trade and not by land trade. We don't have the same problems with the fleas of transmitting disease, and that makes them a little bit safer. Environmental degradation. We do see human beings have effects on their environment. This is one of the key themes for the course. The best examples of these, we have 3 kind of examples of things affecting the environment, 2 of which are conducted by human beings. The other one was an environmental phenomenon. Overgrazing in the state of Zimbabwe, in the capital, Great Zimbabwe. We saw the walled city and we saw agriculture within the walled city, but because we saw too much overgrazing there, it wasn't available for people to live in the walled city anymore, so they had to desert Great Zimbabwe, the capital. In feudal Europe, because of the implementation of the 3-field system, we now have multiple fields being used. You have to cut down trees to do that. That's going to lead to soil erosion, which is going to create problems in the future because we have less soil to be used and can't yield more crops. And then the Little Ice Age, which obviously isn't human-made, but because of the general cooling of the climate, it's going to lead to less agricultural production. Thus, if you have less agriculture, you can't have as many people living in one place. If you can't have as many people living in one place, you're not going to have as many cities. That's the biggest effect of the Little Ice Age, is we don't have as many cities or urbanization in that time period. And finally, we talk about the 3 great travelers. The reason why I hit this so hard with you guys, and I know I hit this hard with you guys in the regular school year, is that if we have our DBQ from this time period, guys, we're going to have sources from these travelers because there's just so little written about other culture. These are going to be your quote unquote objective writers, and of course they're not objective, and that's one of the things that we need to be able to do when we happy these documents, is we need to be able to talk about each individual traveler's bias. Marco Polo is going to visit the court of Kublai Khan. He's going to write about China's size and wealth, and Marco Polo is especially attributed to popularizing China to European travel and adding to that desire to make it to China, and actually adding to the European monarchs' desire to find a quicker route to China, which of course is going to flourish, add to the age of exploration. Ibn Battuta, his travels are religious based. He's a devout Muslim. He's going to spend 30 years traveling Eurasia, but he's going to travel to mostly Muslim lands. And because of this, his journeys aren't so much like Marco Polo's to come in search of adventure. He's more to learn about Islam and its people and go on kind of a spiritual journey. And so he is going to have that lens as he's traveling to these different places. He's going to glorify different Muslim states because of his belief that Islam is very central to the way he sees the world. And last but not least, we have Marjorie Kemp, who's perhaps our least heralded of the 3. writers, and she's an interesting story. She's a middle class English woman who is going to have just be a normal middle class mother. In fact, she's going to have 14 children. And her first writings, she writes an autobiography about herself, and her first writings are very simple and basic. She talks about being jealous of her neighbors for having a new dress. But then, after her 14th child, her last child, she has this spiritual conversion. She has this sudden feeling and connectiveness with God. And so she is going to then go on some travels because of her Christianity. She's going to travel to Rome and Germany and Spain. She's going to write about her pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And not only is this going to have this religious lens to it, but it's also going to have a unique lens of having a writing from a middle class woman, which in Europe is very, very rare to have. And so this provides some important insight into lives of women in the time period. Okay, guys, here's your DBQ assignment. Analyze the effects of the Mongols on Eurasia between circa 1200 and 1450. We have 5 documents, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I think you guys will find this might be a little bit more difficult than the last one, but at the same time, you guys are more than able to handle it. You guys are academic giants, and I believe in you. Miss you guys. I'm excited to see you guys. Today is Monday, so I'm excited to see you guys on Wednesday. Have a great day, Whappers, and I will talk to you guys soon.